on Wednesday, we looked at simple yarns, and they either come in single, ply, cord, or rope. And so today we're looking at what we call novelty or complex, and then we'll look at composite as well. So we're going to first start with our novelty or complex yarns, which these names are used interchangeably. Some people will call them novelty yarns, some people will call them complex yarns. But what those yarns are they are yarns that have an effect to them. So rather than being smooth and uniform all the way down the length of that yarn like your simple yarns are, you're going to have surface texture that's added to those yarns. The durability of that yarn is going to be dependent upon the size of the effect and how that effect is held into the yarn. Okay, so how the pieces are put together and the size of that. Okay, so you can have novelty or specialty yarns or complex yarns that are single. Okay, and a single specialty or complex yarn is that it has one part that makes up the yarn. But because of the fiber content of that, it's considered a complex or a novelty yarn. So an example of that is like a metallic yarn. Metallic yarn only has the one part to it, the one fiber of metal yarn, but because it's a metal, it's considered a complex or a specialty yarn. Most of our novelty yarns are what we call complex. So complex means that it has two or more parts that are used to make that yarn. And it will increase the diameter, the strength, and the performance of the yarn as you begin to make a complex or put those pieces together to make that yarn. As far as where do we use complex or novelty yarns, they are designed to add decorative surface interest to our fabrics or surface effects. So they're more decorative than they are and therefore true structure of the garment. They are most often used in the filling direction. Depending upon the type of novelty or complex yarn, we will see them in the warp direction as well. But if they're only in one direction, they're going to be in the filling direction because that's the direction of the fabric that has less stress on that part. All right. So as we talk about the parts of a novelty yarn, when you begin to have a novelty yarn that is our complex yarn that has two or more parts, they have what we call the ground, which is the base yarn of the yarn. Okay, so this can be a spun yarn, it can be a monofilament, it can be a multi-filament. Okay, so this is the base of that yarn. Then you have a yarn that is somehow wrapped around that ground or base yarn, and that creates the effect. So that's what creates the surface design or the surface interest of that yarn. And then you have a third yarn that's the binder. So this is wrapped around both your effect yarn and your ground or base yarn to hold them together. So rather than using a spinning process where we twist individual fibers to make that yarn, as we have in our simple yarns, we're adding another yarn as a binder to hold those together. Okay, so you have three parts. You have the base or ground, your effect yarn, and your binder yarn. All right, so what are the types? Well, let me show you this first. So this is an example of it in an actual yarn. So this kind of bluish purple, real small, this is your base yarn. Okay, then you have the thick yarn, which is your effect yarn, and then you have your binder, this thin uniform yarn here that's actually being wrapped to hold your effect and your base together. Types of novelty yarns. The first one is what we call a slub or a thick and thin yarn. Okay. And this is where you have two yarns that are uniform, but as we add the twist, we vary the tension of those two yarns to create areas where we have reduced twist that creates our slub or our thick and thin. Okay, so to create this yarn, we have two yarns, okay? And these are simple yarns right here. So these yarns, if they were used individually, would be smooth along the uniform along the length of that yarn. But as we make a ply out of this yarn, we vary the tension of the twist, okay? So as we vary the tension of the twist, then we get these areas where you have an untwisted yarn that creates a slub or a thick and thin section along the length of the yarn. So then it becomes an ununiform yarn because it has those areas that are the untwisted area. Okay, this area that's untwisted, you cannot remove that from the yarn. If you were to try to pull this part out, you're actually going to tear the yarn apart. Okay, so you can't remove that. So here's an example of thick and thin or slub in actual full yarn. And so you can see here how you have a tight tension or twist added right here. And then this section right here is your slub. So you've reduced the tension on one of the yarns. The other one is still tighter. And as that happens, you get this untwisted or slub area just randomly along the length of the yarn. Okay. All right, your second type of yarn that falls into this grouping is called a flock or a flake. Okay, so this is a ply yarn, and how this is created is that we actually insert sections of fiber into the yarn as it's being twisted. So we have small tufts of fibers that are inserted into the yarns as they're being made into a ply. Those small tufts, which are known as our flocks or our flakes, are usually colored yarns. So we're creating a random surface interest of just specks or spots of color within our yarn. These, you can actually pull out your small tuft of fiber or your flock or flake, and you're not going to destroy the yarn itself. Okay, so these are things that are added in that add visual interest but don't affect the strength, the durability of that fiber or yarn. So this is an example of fabric that has been done with a flock yarn. And so that flock yarn is what's creating these little sections of color that you see randomly here in your fabric. This is how we make tweeds as far as a fabric. We add in the novelty yarn or the flocked yarn into that fabric. All right. Your third type is a nub, a knot, or a spot. And those are just all the same name. They're used interchangeably when we talk about this. So what happens here is you have your yarns that you're twisting together, but as the yarns are being twisted together, you have one of the yarns where you actually create a knot in the yarn. So you actually twist up the yarn so that it makes kind of a knot in that yarn. And those knots then become these bubbles, for lack of better term, that sit on the yarn. When they are woven into a fabric, then they create a third dimension or surface area or surface design in the fabrics. Okay, and they're done at irregular intervals, so they're not necessarily set like every 5 inches or every 10 inches on the yarn. You're going to see this. So you're just twisting that yarn to create a knot. So this is an example of what that looks like in actual fabric. So this is how we create what we call antique satin. And the nubs or the knots are right here. So as that's woven in, this creates or stands on the surface of the fabric and begins to create texture or surface interest in that. So all of these spots, so this is another one, here's one. So you can see them randomly within the fabric that creates surface interest as you have a knot that's on the surface of the fabric. Okay. A snarl yarn is where you begin to create this back and forth, just open loop within your effect yarn. So you have your base yarn right here that's there, and then you have your effect yarn, which many times is a multi-filament because we don't have necessarily a lot of twist that's added in this. And then it just goes back and forth. The binder actually wraps around there and holds those together. So if you think of a snarl, think of a snake that's just winding itself back and forth along the ground, or and that's what you think of as your fiber. So it creates an open loop as it is put into the yarn. So this is a snarl in the fabric. So again, you can see that it's used in the filling direction, which is the crosswise, and then it just adds surface interest because you have these three-dimensional shapes or yarns that are sitting there that don't have a lot of twist in them, so it allows the fibers to show that interest within the fabric. All right, a boucle is another novelty yarn that is created with loops. The difference between the boucle and the snarl is that the boucle has what we call a closed loop. Okay, so you get almost this circle look to your effect yarn that is created along the length of that yarn. And many times the boucle loops are at a fairly regular interval with that. So our base yarn here, we have the effect yarn that's going back and forth, which is similar to how that snarl is put in, except that as we put our binding yarn on there, we're actually pulling the effect yarn together to make a closed loop. So rather than the effect yarn wrapping completely around the core yarn or the base yarn, it's actually kind of laying on top of it, back and forth on top, and the binder actually holds it together and closes that yarn. So this is boucle in a suiting. So all of these little circles are your boucle yarns, your loops on your boucle. So this gives a lot of surface interest. It also creates a fabric that is very easy to snag because those loops are just floating on the surface. And so you have to be very careful. That is definitely just a surface interest yarn. Is used in the filling direction of your fabrics. Okay, here's one that's a solid color. but you can see all of the boucle loops that add surface interest to that. All right, then you have a ratteen yarn, and this again has loops to it. And this is a yarn where our effect yarn already has loops made in it before it is actually applied to our core yarn or our base yarn with the binder. So if we were to undo this yarn, our effect yarn is already going to be textured or looped. So then as we apply that yarn over our core yarn with our binder, you get these random loops that happen along the length of the yarn. They can be random sizes, they can be randomly placed along the length of the yarn. And this is, when you begin to bind this, we do a very tight twist on this. So where your boucle or your snarl a lot of times has a looser twist, your ratteen is going to have a high twist around your core. All right, a corkscrew is made from two simple yarns. So they're very smooth along the texture. They're evenly twisted. But what makes this a fancy yarn is that your two simple yarns are different sizes to begin with. So they have a different diameter of the yarns themselves when we start. And so you get a thick yarn and a thin yarn that are twisted together to create your corkscrew. This is corkscrew. This is a combination. So you have corkscrew, and you also have a few boucles in there, but your corkscrew is two different size yarns. A lot of times your corkscrew will also be different colors in those two yarns that are different sizes to add additional surface interest to that. And then you have chenille. And this is where an extra set of yarns forms a pile that goes all the way around that core or that base yarn. This produces a very soft yarn in texture. And probably an example that makes this make the most sense is to think of a pipe cleaner. Okay. And if you think of a pipe cleaner, you think of the little fiber ends that come off of that and make it soft. So that's what you're creating when you create a chenille yarn. It's just that we're not using a piece of metal normally as that base yarn to start with. And so this is chenille in suiting. So where that is all of these right here. So it creates a very soft yarn with that. Sometimes you could do this to make blankets as well. You'll see that to create a very soft look in those. This is a slub. This is a flock. Okay. Again, slubs. These are slubs. So you can see how you begin to get surface interest, and you can change the look of a fabric by changing what yarn you're using to make that fabric. So this shows you some diagrams of those. You can kind of see that. So this is your slub where you have the high tension and twist, and then you've released the twist, so you get this untwisted area. The spiral or corkscrew is very uniform, but you have two different size yarns that are going there. Ratteen is that yarn that's it's twisted on top of itself. It has a very high twist, so it kind of creates the idea that they're actually kinking back on top of themselves, those loops. Okay. Again, your knot or your spot where you've twisted and actually made a knot out of the yarn. Your spike or your snarl where you think more of that snake versus your loop or your boucle, which actually has those closed loops at a regular interval within your yarns. All right, then our other type of yarn is what we call composite yarns. Okay, and composite yarns are a yarn that is regular in appearance, but it has unlike components that are used to make it. Okay. The base idea of composite yarns is usually you have some characteristic of that base yarn that's being covered is not a characteristic that you want for aesthetics or for performance. Well, you want it for performance, but you don't want it for aesthetics. With that, it's not comfortable to wear. You can't dye it, those kind of things. So we cover it with something else so that we can get the positive characteristics of that core yarn, but not have to use or overcome the negative characteristics of that yarn. Okay, so regular in appearance, unlike components. So the types of composite yarns are a covered yarn. And so a covered yarn is you have a base yarn and you have another yarn that wraps around that yarn. So with a covered yarn that wraps around it will provide some covering to the base yarn, but it doesn't necessarily 100% hide the base yarn. So you can still see the base yarn underneath or through the yarn that's being wrapped around it. A second type is core spun. And this is where you have one fiber that becomes the center or the core of your yarn. You have another yarn that wraps around that. A core spun yarn, the center yarn or the base yarn is going to be completely covered. And you're not going to see it unless you begin to unwrap the yarn that's wrapped around the core. And then you have wrap spun. So wrap spun, again, is where you have a yarn that's wrapping around it, but a wrap spun, the center yarn or the base yarn is a spun yarn, and the yarn that wraps is a filament. Where a lot of times your core spun, the center yarn is a filament, and it can be wrapped with filaments or it can be wrapped with spun yarns. Wrap spun yarns add strength to spun yarn. So by adding that filament, we can make a stronger spun yarn than if we just have a single spun yarn. So this is a covered yarn, okay? So we have rubber as our core, which rubber, has some negative characteristics of it doesn't dye well, it's not comfortable to have next to the skin. So then we wrap it with a polyester. We can color polyester. It's a little bit, has some characteristics we want. But if you look right in here, you can see that it's not tightly covered. You can actually see the rubber yarn or the core yarn through those polyester wraps around the yarn. This is another example of a wrapped yarn, and this is what we call a double wrapped or double covered, just because we have our base yarn here, which is a spandex monofilament. It's wrapped twice, so that's why it's double covered, okay? So it's wrapped with another filament yarn, which is your multi-filament, and then it's wrapped with metallic, okay? So this metallic itself, by itself, would be considered a fancy yarn, even though it's a monofilament because it's metal. But then this becomes a composite yarn because the way that we're actually covering it. All right, these are core spun, okay? So you have where you can wrap with a filament, you can wrap with a spun, okay? And then this is a multi-filament wrapped. This is spandex, and this is wrapped with a flat filament. So you can wrap with a flat filament, you can wrap with a round. So it just means that core spun means the difference between a covered and a coarse spun is that we're not going to see the base yarn in a coarse spun, but we can see it in a wrapped. Okay. A wrap spun then is that we have our base is spun yarns. So this is a simple spun yarn here with short staple fibers that we wrap a filament around to increase the strength of that spun yarn. An example of a coarse spun. Okay, so if we were just to look at this yarn in its regular cross section or length of it, what we see is the yarn that's wrapped. Okay, so if we were looking at this when we first look at it, our first reaction is that this is probably just a simple a simple spun yarn with staple fibers, because we can see the fiber ends coming off. It's uniform along the length. Okay, but when we begin to untwist it, we find that there's actually a filament in the center here that has been wrapped with a spun yarn. Okay, and you're not going to see that base yarn or that filament yarn unless you begin to unwrap it. And this is how most of our yarns that have spandex in the core are made. Okay, because spandex has great elasticity with it, which is the positive characteristic we want, but it doesn't dye well. It is uncomfortable to wear. So to be able to get colors, to be able to get the comfort, we wrap them with a spun yarn. Okay. Or here we've wrapped it with a polyester staple. So you can wrap it with this any type of yarn you want, but when you look at it, your first reaction is going to be that it's either just a simple staple or a simple filament yarn to that, until you actually begin to untwist it and find that you have that filament within inside of it. Most of our sewing thread is a coarse spun thread. And what this is that we have a polyester yarn in the middle and we have cotton wrapped around it. The reason that we do this is because polyester gives us the strength that we need to use as a sewing thread to hold all of our different fabrics together as we make garments. But the cotton gives us all the variation in colors that we need to easily match a fabric that we're sewing. Okay. All right, so then yarn performance. As we begin to look at yarn performance, how do we characterize that, or what goes into it? So we look at characteristics and performance of that to ensure that we get a consistent yarn which produces a consistent fabric. Okay, it's going to affect the product, the quality of the product, and the performance based on how consistent that yarn is put together. And things that we look at with that are, I don't know what my slide looks like, is the size, the twist, the bulk, the evenness of that yarn, okay, the overall appearance of it. And then we also look at the strength of that yarn, the abrasion resistance. So our fancy yarns are not going to have the abrasion resistance that our simple yarns or our composite yarns will have. So that'll affect the performance of those yarns. Okay, so we look at strength, abrasion resistance, size, twist, evenness, the bulkiness of our yarns for performance. We also look at quality. And when we're thinking about quality, it's if that yarn is supposed to be uniform along the length, is it uniform, or are there thin spots? Because as you begin to have thin spots in your yarn, that affects the performance of it, because it's more likely to break at that point or to pull apart within the processing of that, within the use of it. We look for what we call NEPs, N-E-P-S, and these are small knots or entangled fibers that we don't want. Okay, so we want those in are knot yarns, but we don't want them in just our regular yarns, because when you have those, you get uneven dyeing with that, because those yarns that are twisted up in that knot but aren't twisted in the yarn itself will dye a different color. So you begin to get unevenness there, which then causes your fabrics to have uneven dye spots in them that can affect the performance or the quality in that. And then we look at what we call the hairiness of that yarn. Okay, so the fiber ends that are protruding from that. Are there excessive fiber ends on the surface? Because the more fiber ends you have, the more problems you're going to have with abrasion. Okay, so we want those to be at a minimum that we can. Now, depending on if we have a staple or a filament fiber to begin with, is going to affect that hairiness of it, or how we put that yarn together if we have a novelty yarn with that. So you have problems with abrasion and pilling, because remember those fiber ends are what creates those knots that make the pills that, depending on the strength of the fiber itself, sometimes they're more likely to fall off if they're a weaker fiber. But if you get those knots on your yarns and it's a strong fiber, they're going to sit there as little balls on the surface and become very unattractive as far as the appearance of your product. Oops. All right, so this is what we're talking about, the hairiness of those yarns, those fiber ends that protrude out from that. Bulk yarns create more hairiness to that, more texture with that as well. All right, so where do we see yarns used? Okay, so apparel, spun yarns with a medium twist are often used to manufacture like our casual wear. Our fine combed or worsted yarns are used in high quality shirts, especially for men, like dress shirts. Worsted wools you think of for business suits. Novelty yarns, as far as apparel, we see those mainly in women's suits and dresses. Filament yarns that we have little twist in them, so multi-filaments that don't have a lot of twist, we see in intimate apparel. We see it in gowns that we want, where we want high luster. Pantyhose, which we don't see a lot of those much worn anymore, but that would be where we would also see filament yarns. Core spun are used where we need stretch in our garments, especially when we need that high stretch. So we see them in waistbands, elastic in waistbands. We see them in a lot of our athletic wear, our swimwear. Bulk yarns are used where we want to create warmth or insulation. So we see those a lot in jackets for like cold weather. High twist yarns, so like our crepe yarns, we see those where we want something that's very drapable. So we see it a lot in women's blouses, sometimes suits, dresses. We want something that'll cling to the body. And then yarns that are loosely twisted, so have lower twist, especially our spun yarns in that, where we want something that creates a, where we can brush those fiber ends up to create a fabric with texture, with some warmth to it. So that's how we create like our flannels. We would use a loosely twisted yarn to create those, to get that soft fabric with that. Blankets would be another place we would use that. As far as interiors, we see a lot of bulk filaments used in interiors, especially to manufacture carpets, because we need something that has a lot of surface to it that's very bulky, that when you step on it, it's going to spring back. We see a lot of novelty yarns used to add texture to draperies and upholstered fabric. Filament yarns with low twist a lot of times are used also for draperies where we want luster. And then ply yarns we see to make things like lampshades, where we need something that has more structure to it. It needs to be a little bit stiffer in the fabric itself. Our upholstery fabric, some of those are plies as well. Institutional, we see a lot of spun yarns to make linens, bed linens. We see loosely twisted spun yarns to make terry cloth, or to make towels, where you have the loops on your towels to actually absorb the water. The low twist will help increase the absorbency of the towels. And then technical, we see high denier filament yarns are a lot of times used for soft-sided luggage. Tape yarns, so the flat tape yarns, we see those to make fruit and vegetable bags. Monofilament yarns that have elasticity are used for toys. So y'all know what the cush ball is? It's a little ball that looks like just a whole bunch of little short monofilament fibers or yarns, and it's kind of loosely done. Those fibers just kind of bounce around. It's real soft. So those would be monofilaments. Anything that you have toy-wise that stretches, that are made out of yarns, would be that. Monofilaments are used for medical uses, sutures, so your stitches are a monofilament thread. Ropes are made a lot of times out of our cords for that. So that's where we see a lot of our technical uses. All right, so that's our yarns. Let's look at our yarn swatches. Look at number 6. Number 6 is, mine is green. It says spiral or corkscrew. Type of yarn is that? What makes it the spiral or corkscrew? Okay. So if we look at that, and you may have to get out your magnifying glass if you need to, but you can see here that it's 2 smooth yarns or simple yarns, but you have a small one and you have a large one that are wrapped uniformly to make that corkscrew or that spiral. Okay, so description, so things about that are, they're 2 simple yarns, they're uneven sizes, but evenly wrapped, so you have even tension. Okay. All right. All right, what about number 7? 7 is your slub or thick and thin. Mine's kind of a rust color. What is it that makes, what makes the slub or the thick and thin? So as you're looking at this yarn, you have tight twist here, you get loose twist right here, and then it begins to get tight twist here. So this creates your slub or your thick and thin right there. Okay. The focus is not going to focus. Okay. There, see a little bit better there. It's thick, it's thin here, it gets thick there, then it begins to get thin again. Here you get that less twist and get that slub. Okay. All right. What about 8? 8 is what we call our flock, flake, or seed. Mine is a cream color, is the base of it. All right. So what makes a flock or a flake yarn? It's these little tufts of colored yarn that are inserted randomly along the length of the yarn. So you have a simple ply yarn here, but because you've added these tufts in, you become a novelty yarn. So that's where we can pull these tufts out, but we haven't affected the integrity of the base yarn. All right, what about number 9? That's your boucle. So what is your boucle? Your boucle is where you get these closed loops at regular interval along the length of your yarn. Okay. For this one, you've actually got an additional surface to that because your binder and your base are actually 2 different colors. So you begin to get that interest as well. But you have those closed loops. So it lays on top of your base yarn, but is closed in there, wrapped around with your binder. All right, number 10 is chenille. What's characteristic about this fiber or yarn? So chenille is those extra yarns or those plies that are added to it that create the ends that protrude all the way out around it. Okay, creating that very soft yarn. All right. Let's see. Okay, we'll go ahead and do it. Number 12 is a coarse spun. Mine's purple. So if I look at it, I just see a very, very tight actual purple yarn. But if I pull on it, I begin to untwist it. You can, if you pull on it, you can see the elasticity in that. That's where you have, most likely y'all have either a polyester covered rubber or a cotton covered rubber, or you have a polyester covered spandex. So you have an elastomeric fiber that is in there that is giving you the elasticity. The yarn is wrapped around it. If you were to untwist this, you would begin to see the core yarn in there. Right. So I untwisted the end of mine. Okay, so I have a elastomeric yarn that has a spun yarn or a filament yarn, depending on if it's cotton or polyester, that's wrapped around there. So when I look at the yarn itself, just in its thing, it looks just like a simple yarn, but if you pull it apart, you can undo the elastomeric from the cover yarn. All right, 14, we didn't talk about this, but this is what they call eyelash. And this is where you just have long, and these are fiber, so it's kind of like your chenille. These are fibers that are added to that, the additional fibers, and they're long to create that texture or surface interest to your yarn. If you pull out the fibers that make the eyelash, it doesn't destroy the actual yarn itself. So in that way, it's kind of like a flock. All right, 15 is your snarl. Okay, they've actually added extra texture to it with the yarns that are coming out, but your snarl is your pink that is wrapped back and forth along your base yarn. So you create open loops with that. Okay. 16 is your knot or your spot or your nub. Okay, and right here you can see where they have the cream colored yarn which got twisted or knotted up, and it left that bump there, or the peach color here, the green down there where they knotted up the yarn as it was being twisted together to create the surface interest of that. So this yarn is actually 3 yarns. It's a green yarn, a black yarn, and well, it's actually 4. I'm sorry, a green, a peach, a cream, and a black. And so every so often along the length of that, those individual yarns are knotted to create the surface interest. All right, then 17 is your last yarn in your swatches. And that is your braided cord. And this is a type of composite yarn. If you were to tear that yarn apart, you have a core that's inside, okay, that is covered with a yarn or that has been braided together to actually create the yarn. So it's a covered yarn. So you have these filaments inside that when you pull it apart, those come about without any twist, but they're held together by the braided yarn that's on top of it.